There is a story the world was never supposed to know. A story buried under centuries of misdirection, colonial erasure, and deliberate academic silence. A story that belongs to you, to every person of African descent who has ever been told that your ancestors contributed nothing to the march of human civilization. Today, that lie ends. Because the archaeological record, the metallurgical evidence, and the reconstructed GDP data of the ancient world all point to the same undeniable conclusion: the kingdoms of Nubia, sitting in the heart of northeastern Africa, operated iron and steel production systems so vast, so sophisticated, and so economically dominant that they outproduced every nation in Europe combined, not for a decade, not for a century, but for 1,500 years. Let that sink in. While Rome was still figuring out its aqueducts, while the kingdoms of medieval Europe were trading in livestock and timber, the people of Meroe were running an industrial economy built on steel. This is not mythology. This is not wishful revisionism. This is documented, measurable, verifiable history. And for the African diaspora today, for Black communities in America, the Caribbean, Brazil, the United Kingdom, across the continent and scattered throughout the world, knowing this history is not just empowering. It is necessary. It is armor. The civilization at the center of this story is the Kingdom of Kush, and more specifically its imperial capital of Meroe, located in what is today the northern Sudan, along the eastern bank of the Nile River, between the 5th and 6th cataracts. The Kushite kingdom had deep roots, stretching back to at least 2500 BC when the city of Koma, one of the earliest urbanized centers in sub-Saharan Africa, first rose to prominence. But it was during the Meroitic period, roughly 300 BC to 350 CE, that Nubian civilization reached its most extraordinary industrial heights. The rulers of this era, among them Queen Amanirenas, who famously defeated a Roman legion and forced Augustus Caesar to the negotiating table, and King Natikomani, whose building projects rivaled those of any pharaoh, presided over an economy of staggering complexity. Meroe was not a village. It was a metropolis. It was a hub. Sitting at the intersection of trade routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa to Egypt, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean world, Meroe processed and exported iron on a scale that modern archaeologists have only recently begun to fully comprehend. The slag heaps, the waste byproduct of iron smelting, found at Meroe are so enormous that 19th-century British explorers initially mistook them for natural geological formations. They are not. They are the industrial exhaust of a civilization that was manufacturing iron for more than a millennium before Europe developed comparable capacity. Scholars including the economist Angus Maddison, whose reconstructed historical GDP data forms one of the most comprehensive pictures of ancient economic output ever assembled, and more recently researchers building on UNESCO's General History of Africa project, have drawn conclusions that align with what the physical evidence has been telling us for decades. Nubia's iron economy was not peripheral. It was central. It was dominant. And it fed an entire hemisphere. Now we must talk about what happened to this knowledge, because it did not simply fade. It was targeted. The suppression of Nubian and African industrial history is one of the most calculated acts of intellectual violence in modern scholarship. When European explorers and colonial administrators arrived in the Nile Valley in the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered pyramids, temples, and iron slag heaps that could not be reconciled with the story they needed to tell, a story in which Africa had no history worth speaking of, no civilization worth crediting, and no achievement worth recording. The response was not curiosity. It was erasure. British Egyptologists in the Victorian era systematically attributed Nubian achievements to outside influences, to Egyptian migration, to Mediterranean contact, to anything and anyone but the African people who actually built these cities and fired these furnaces. This was not accidental scholarship. It was ideological work in service of empire. Figures like Charles Lepsius, the German Egyptologist who conducted extensive surveys of Meroitic sites in the 1840s, did document what he found, but his interpretive framework consistently diminished the independent genius of Nubian civilization, subordinating it to Egyptian or foreign influence. The great British archaeologist Sir E. A. Wallis Budge, who served as keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum, was so committed to the hierarchy of civilizations that he removed artifacts from Sudanese sites and recontextualized them within narratives that erased their Nubian origin. Meanwhile, the broader academic establishment of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was building what scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop and later Martin Bernal would identify as a deliberately constructed false history, one in which Greece was the origin of civilization, Africa was the recipient of civilization, and the black people of the Nile Valley were, at best, a footnote. Colonial education systems across Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas reinforced this fiction in classrooms, in textbooks, and in the minds of generations of black children who were taught to see themselves as people without a past. The economic data was not suppressed through a single dramatic act. It was suppressed through decades of omission, through the simple refusal of mainstream historical economics to include African civilizations in comparative analyses of ancient productivity, trade, and industrial output. But suppression is never total. Because truth has a way of surviving in the most unexpected places. The physical evidence of Meroitic iron production is one of the great undestroyable archives of African history. Those slag heaps at Meroe, some of them covering acres of ground and rising meters into the air, cannot be removed, cannot be rewritten, and cannot be argued away. They are there. They are measurable. When modern archaeologists like Laszlo Torok, whose work on Meroitic civilization represents some of the most rigorous scholarship of the late 20th century, conducted systematic analysis of Meroitic industrial sites, the findings confirmed what the physical scale had always suggested: this was mass production. This was organized, sustained, intentional industrial output on a scale that no contemporary European society could match. The knowledge survived also in the hands of African metallurgical traditions that continued long after Meroe's political decline. The iron smelting techniques developed along the Nile and across the broader African continent, techniques involving the construction of sophisticated preheating furnaces that produced temperatures far exceeding those of comparable European bloomeries, were passed from generation to generation, community to community, across the Sahel, the Great Lakes region, and West Africa. Scholars studying the Haya people of Tanzania, for instance, found in the 1970s that their traditional iron smelting technology produced carbon steel using a preheating technique that was not independently developed in Europe until the 19th century. This is not coincidence. This is inheritance. The survival of this knowledge also lives in language. The Meroitic script, which remains one of the few ancient writing systems not yet fully deciphered, represents a body of knowledge and cultural expression that we have not yet fully recovered. But the survival of Cushitic and Nilo-Saharan languages throughout northeastern Africa traces the unbroken human continuity of these civilizations. The pyramids of Meroe, there are more pyramids in Sudan than in Egypt, a fact that startles most people the first time they encounter it, stand as architectural testimony that requires no translation and no interpreter. They are simply, magnificently there. The living legacy of Nubian industrial and civilizational achievement is not confined to archaeology or ancient history. It pulses through the present. The Republic of Sudan, despite the devastating political conflicts that have torn it in recent decades, has been home to active archaeological programs that are recovering and reasserting the Nubian past. The Sudan National Museum in Khartoum houses one of the most significant collections of Meroitic artifacts in the world, and Sudanese archaeologists and historians have been fighting, sometimes literally under fire, to preserve and communicate this heritage. In the broader African diaspora, the intellectual tradition that centers African achievement has never been stronger. The work of Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese physicist and historian who spent his career demonstrating the African origins of civilization and the continuity between ancient Egypt, Nubia, and sub-Saharan Africa, laid groundwork that scholars across multiple disciplines continue to build on. Institutions like Howard University, the University of Ghana at Legon, and the African Studies Centers of universities from Lagos to London are producing research that systematically reconstructs what colonialism attempted to destroy. In the African American community,